What comes to mind when you hear Carthage? A determined rival of Rome, seemingly poised for triumph before being wiped out. That familiar summary is true only in outline. In this film we trace 8 centuries of its history, from a humble coastal outpost to a Mediterranean titan, and finally to its ruin. But to tell Carthage's story properly, we must first go back 4 centuries, to the age after the Bronze Age collapse. Egypt's power had waned, and along the Levantine shore a cluster of city-states, Sidon, Byblos, Sarepta, Tripoli, and above all Tyre, had reasserted their independence. These were the Phoenicians, unparalleled mariners and traders whose ships stitched together the Mediterranean. To support that vast network, they founded hundreds of settlements across North Africa, Cyprus, Sicily, Sardinia, and the Iberian coast. Those outposts were largely self-governing, yet they retained ties to their mother cities and commonly paid an annual tribute. The Greeks later named them Phoenix after the famed purple cloth they exported. The Romans called them Puni, which is why our telling of their wars with Rome uses the term Punic. According to tradition, in 814 BCE a Tyrian princess named Dido fled her city with a small retinue and established a new settlement on North Africa's shore. They called it Carthage, literally, new city. Myth or memory, the story captures a truth. Archaeology places Carthage's foundation in the late 9th century BCE. At first it was a small trading station, home to perhaps 1,000 people, paying tribute to Tyre and local Libyan chiefs. Its position, however, near the narrowest point of the Tunisian Strait, proved a stroke of geographic fortune. It commanded a gateway between east and west, and as ships passed, trade, ideas and influence flowed through its harbors. After Dido's generation, Carthage evolved into an oligarchic republic. Power aggregated in a council of the city's leading families, the Asherat, while major policies were referred to a people's assembly. Though still owing homage to Tyre at first, the city's prosperity soon allowed it to assert its independence. By the 7th century BCE Carthage had begun planting colonies of its own. By 650 BCE it founded Eleusis, the island we now call Ibiza. The fall of Tyre to Nebuchadnezzar II in 586 BCE reshaped the region. Around the same period, under generals like Malchus, Carthage defeated local Libyan forces and shook off tribute obligations for good. Free of external control, it increasingly took on the role once held by Tyre, protector and overseer of the western Phoenician settlements. The city opposed threats from land and the tide of Greek settlement in the west. In the mid-6th century BCE Carthage briefly experimented with monarchy. Mago I claimed the throne and skillfully aligned his fleet with Etruscan interests to counter Greek expansion. At Alalia, off Corsica's coast, a clash with Greek forces left the Greeks staggered despite claiming victory. The strategic outcome favored Carthaginian and Etruscan aims. Sardinia came under Carthaginian influence, and by the close of Mago's rule most Phoenician outposts in the western Mediterranean had fallen into Carthage's orbit, some willingly, others by force, as at Gades, modern Cadiz. It's important to stress how Carthage governed those dependencies, with a hands-off imperial model. Distant settlements kept autonomy but entered binding agreements. They paid a tithe, aligned diplomatically with Carthage, and were obliged to supply troops when summoned. This web of alliances made Carthage a commercial hegemon rather than a territorially centralized empire. In 510 BCE a Spartan prince, Dorius, attempted to found a colony in Africa but was repulsed by Carthage allied with Libyan forces. A year later Rome expelled the Etruscans and emerged as a new republic. A treaty was struck between Rome and Carthage that set limits on each power's naval movements and promised mutual non-aggression. For a time the two states coexisted, Carthage dominant at sea, Rome consolidating on land. Sicily became the continent's fault line. By the early 5th century BCE western Sicily and its Phoenician pockets answered to Carthage while eastern Sicily gravitated to Greek city-states led by Syracuse. In 480 BCE Carthage launched a major expedition to seize the island but suffered disaster at Himera. The defeat cost the Carthaginian king his life and led to a dramatic constitutional change. The monarchy was abolished and the city adopted a republican system led by 2 annually elected suffetes and a 300-member senate drawn from the wealthy elite. Despite the loss and political upheaval, Carthage retained its holdings in Sicily and redirected its energies. This was the era of Carthaginian reach. Expeditions and daring voyages extended their knowledge of the seas and lands. Hanno sailed down Africa's west coast, perhaps reaching the latitude of Mount Cameroon and sighting the Canaries. Hamilcar voyaged past Iberia and up into Gaul and the British Isles. Other parties forged Saharan trade routes east to Egypt. Tales of Carthaginian coins found on remote islands tantalize historians, but the evidence remains debated. Carthage's advantage at sea was not simply skill but industrial discipline. Their shipyards developed early standardization. Keels, frames and fittings marked and prefabricated so hulls could be assembled quickly. Where Greek and Roman shipwrights took weeks, Carthaginian fleets could be raised and repaired on a vast and efficient scale. This logistical leap underpinned both commerce and naval power. Religious life in Carthage grew from Phoenician roots but absorbed many influences. Baal-Hamon stood at the apex as a god of fertility and vigor, often shown with a scepter and a sacred bull at his side. Tanit, his partner, became the city's chief protective deity, a symbol of life, war and renewal, her emblem appearing on shrines and standards. Other gods like Melkart, Eshmun and Resheph were worshipped as guardians of sailors, healers and war. Yet religion also became one of the city's most contentious legacies. Greek and Roman authors accused Carthaginians of child sacrifice, and for centuries these claims were dismissed as hostile propaganda. Modern archaeology, with excavations of tophets, open sanctuaries containing urns, animal remains and stelae, has complicated that dismissal. While scholars still debate scale and intent, most now accept that some ritual offerings of children took place in particular contexts, later giving way to animal and symbolic offerings as customs evolved. From 409 BCE Carthage pressed anew into Sicilian affairs, initiating conflicts that would endure for more than a century. The balance of power swung and shifted. At times the Greeks besieged Carthage itself, at others Carthage recovered ground. When Agathocles of Syracuse died in 289 BCE, the island's politics convulsed. Pyrrhus of Epirus briefly intervened, and mercenary bands carved out fiefdoms, complicating the region. One incident set the stage for a long confrontation with Rome. Mercenaries in Messana invited outside help, Carthage moved in, and Rome responded. An incident with Carthaginian Admiral Hanno, lured and betrayed, inflamed passions on both sides and opened the First Punic War. Sicily became the primary theater. Rome, untested at sea, learned by capturing a stranded Carthaginian ship and reverse engineering its construction. Then, innovating the Corvus boarding device, Romans turned naval warfare into close-quarters combat, offsetting Carthaginian seamanship. The war dragged on and exhausted both sides. By 241 BCE Carthage sued for peace, not decisively beaten in the field, but bankrupted and forced to cede Sicily and pay heavy indemnities. The aftermath was brutal for Carthage. The mercenary war, a savage uprising by unpaid soldiers, threatened to topple the state. Hamilcar Barca quelled the revolt, but Rome's opportunism cost Carthage Corsica and Sardinia, inflaming resentment. Hamilcar turned to Iberia where Carthaginian expansion tapped rich silver mines, rebuilding the city's wealth and military prospects. His successors, Hasdrubal and then his son, Hannibal, consolidated power in Spain and began to set the stage for renewed conflict with Rome. When Hannibal besieged Saguntum, a Roman ally, the treaties were strained beyond repair. The Second Punic War opened with Hannibal's audacious overland march from New Carthage across the Pyrenees and the Alps into Italy, a military feat that shocked the ancient world. In Italy he won a string of victories, culminating in the bloodletting at Cannae where Roman legions were encircled and destroyed. Yet strategic and political objectives eluded him. Southern Italy did not rise wholesale and Rome's allied network largely held firm. Rome adapted by avoiding set-piece battles with Hannibal and by opening new fronts in Spain and Africa. The decisive turning point came as Roman generals struck at Carthage's Iberian base and as Rome secured the loyalty of the Numidians. Hasdrubal's attempt to reinforce Hannibal ended in disaster at the Metaurus in 207 BCE. In 202 BCE, Hannibal faced Scipio Africanus at Zama and suffered a catastrophic defeat. Harsh peace terms stripped Carthage of its overseas possessions, its navy and its ability to wage war without Roman consent. Yet Carthage's resilience unnerved Rome. By 150 BCE the city had rebuilt much of its commercial might. Cato the Elder, alarmed by this recovery, famously ended every speech in the Senate with the refrain, "Carthage must be destroyed." Rome seized upon border disputes with Numidia to justify a final war. An immense Roman army landed in Africa and besieged Carthage. After a 3-year struggle the city fell in 146 BCE. Its population was enslaved, its buildings razed, and the old city was, for all practical purposes, erased. A new Roman settlement would rise on the site a generation later, a Carthage remade as a Roman city, but the ancient Punic polity had ended. The Punic peoples, however, did not vanish in a single instant. Their descendants lived on in North Africa, maintaining language and customs until absorbed by successive waves of conquest and migration, notably the Arab conquests of the 7th century CE. Centuries later, the Roman-born Emperor Septimius Severus, of North African origin and a man who paid tribute to Punic memory, would build temples in Rome honoring Baal and Tanit. The Roman Carthage endured for a millennium after the Punic city's fall, itself finally coming to ruin in later medieval conflicts. So ends one arc of the Mediterranean story, a civilization born of seafaring merchants, forged into a maritime empire, transformed by religion and warfare, and finally extinguished by a rival that had once shared commercial treaties and uneasy peace. Carthage's legacy, in trade, shipbuilding, law and memory, outlived its walls.